I take your notes?
All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real honor to be here. Both my great uncle David Passow and my mother Emily Passow have done a lot of teaching at Gratz College over the years, and it's an honor to continue in their tradition. I'd like to dedicate today's learning to them. So to start, I'd invite you to take a pause from your lunch. Close your eyes if you're comfortable. And I want to invite you to think about a food memory that you have. A vivid memory from your life. It could be from your childhood, it could be from last week, or anywhere in between. Where food played a central role in some way. So take a moment to bring that into your mind's eye. Who's there with you? What are you all doing? What are some of the smells that you can conjure up in this memory? What are some of the sounds in the background? How are you feeling in this moment? And how does it feel to bring that memory back to the present moment? And when you're ready, you can open your eyes, reorient a little bit back to this time and place. Does anyone want to share what that memory was? Yeah.
Mine was the chicken soup I just had recently for Rosh Hashanah, and I had my family.
Mm-hmm. And even though that was a recent experience, I imagine that was not the first time you had chicken soup with your family.
Correct.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Well, started in childhood, a memory of boiled chicken and my mother would make. You know, it was big, delicious, and that couldn't eat it, but that's another story. And then I kind of flashed to her mother's kitchen, my father, and all her wonderful delicacies, rogan, whatever. What's the stuff you stuff the kishka? Do you need a red kishka? Whatever. I wouldn't eat that either. But and then I kind of segued into my kids to current times and my own grandchildren kind of being in the kitchen and trying the roast and what to do. And they're just all good, you know.
Yeah.
Very pleasant, warm, comfortable.
Yeah.
Secure.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Beautiful. Raise your hand if your memory had family involved, right? Yeah, many of you, yeah. Yeah. So food has always been a very central component to the human experience. And food is so intrinsically connected to culture, to tradition, to families. And obviously, our tradition is no exception to that. And so much of our history, our rituals, our holidays, our festivals, the calendar is tied to the cycles of growing food, sharing food, gathering with community to celebrate the harvest and to orient ourselves around the cycles of those seasons. And when I started getting interested in kind of this broader topic of Jewish farming, I asked, what does our tradition have to say about agriculture, about farming? I kind of came to it more by getting interested in sustainable agriculture and organic agriculture. But I was curious, I was connected Jewishly and wanted to understand what our tradition has to offer. So if you start early on in the Garden of Eden, we have our first kind of indication of what our tradition has to say about food and about farming. So God plants a garden in Eden and puts the earthling, and I use that language very specifically. The Hebrew is ha'adam, and the earthling that was formed out of adamah, the ground, right? There's this direct connection between humans and the earth in the most basic way, that we're formed from it. And God puts the human in the garden, and God plants trees that are beautiful and good for food. And there's also the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then God puts the earthling, Adam, into the garden to work it and to protect it, to kind of tend the garden. But also there's this protection element, right? That the humans have a certain stewardship mandate, that we are responsible for protecting the land in some way, even while we engage in it. And that we're instructed to eat of every tree in the garden except for the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? This is probably a story that you're familiar with. And for in the day that we eat of it, we will surely die. Well, Adam and Eve are in the garden for maybe 20 minutes before they decide to eat from this one forbidden tree. And so God finds them and says, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for your sake. Suffering shall you eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to you, and you shall eat the grass of the field. By the sweat of your brow shall you eat bread, until you return to the ground, for out of it you are taken, for you are dust, and unto dust you shall return. So there's a shift here, right? From the original mandate of being in the garden, where there's going to be all these trees that are feeding us, and there's a more kind of reciprocal relationship between humans and the garden, humans and the earth. Now we're instructed that we're going to eat through suffering, through hard work, by sweating, by working very hard, we're going to eat. The way we feed ourselves is shifting. So one way of understanding this story that for me has been really influential is thinking about this transition from the Garden of Eden to outside of the Garden of Eden as the historical agricultural revolution, as the process that human beings went through from going from being hunters and gatherers, like most species on Earth, to becoming farmers, right? And we know that that happened in roughly this part of the world, in roughly the time period that this story takes place. And there's actually several kind of clues or hints that this is a legitimate way of reading the narrative of Genesis. If you go through, and we can go into some of those details, but let's assume that this is what this story is depicting for a minute and see where this kind of leads us in terms of understanding how our tradition thinks about the act of agriculture, right? So the initial framing of agriculture is not that positive, right? It's a punishment, it's a curse. There's now an adversarial relationship between humans and the earth, that it's going to be hard work and a lot of suffering. One hint, by the way, that we see in this text is where it says, and you shall eat the grass of the field, by the sweat of your brow shall you eat bread. Well, the grass of the field are grains, and the first crops that were domesticated by humans were wheat and barley, grains. And pre-agriculture, we don't really have bread, right? Bread requires cultivating grains. It requires processing them for many months, baking them in extremely hot ovens. That's not something that nomadic, migratory, hunter-gatherer people do. So again, a little hint that this might be referring to this transition from hunter-gatherer to farmer. So what is one way that farming could be a curse or a punishment? Or maybe not one way, but what are some of the ways that farming could be a curse or a punishment? Well, first, before we even get there, let's think about the implications of farming, how that changes the human experience. So how many of you ate food today? How many of you grew the food that you ate, or hunted it, or gathered it? We gathered it from the buffet over there. Yeah, right. So, I think I saw maybe like a somewhat skeptical hand go up, but for the most part, none of us had anything to do directly with the food that we ate today. Yay, agriculture, right? That is only possible because of farming, because farming allows a small percentage of the population to grow food for everyone else, and therefore allows everyone else to do other things. Specialization, division of labor, that all comes from agricultural, from the act of agriculture. We also see permanent settlement, right? If we're not relying on the food that's available wildly that we're gonna follow with the seasons, and we're gonna stay in one place, well, if we can grow all the food that we need in this one place, or raise it if you include animals, then we don't have to move. And that allows us to build much more permanent housing, and establish cities, and establish permanent settlement. Really what we think of as civilization is only possible with agriculture. And not that it has to be agriculture as we think of it today, but broadly speaking, the idea of having a small group of the population grow food for everyone else allows civilization to develop. Another important thing that comes from agriculture is the idea of surplus, of extra, having more than you need. Or another way of thinking about it is wealth, right? When you're a farmer, if you have a good season and you're growing the right types of things, you will grow an abundance of those things, and you will be able to store some of them for future use, right? Grains in particular, you dry, you process the grains, you can store that for many years. That is the first real advent of wealth being created on a large scale. Because also when you're a hunter or gatherer and you're migratory people, you're not trying to carry around a whole lot of stuff, right? So you're not trying to accumulate a lot of material wealth. But once we are permanently settled in cities and towns and villages, we can actually start to accumulate more things, more wealth. So this becomes more desirable. Another clue from the text, right? There's a common theme in the Torah throughout Genesis of sibling rivalries, right? Cain and Abel, Abraham and Ishmael, Yaakov and Esav, Jacob and his brothers. Well, sibling rivalries are also in some ways a product of agricultural societies where there's an idea that there's the eldest son will get the birthright, will get the inheritance, right? Because again, in agricultural societies, when you have surplus, you can accumulate wealth, then you have something to pass down to your kids. So lineage becomes really important, and which kids get what becomes really important. And that's partly what we see throughout these repeated themes of sibling rivalries. So one example that comes from the text of ways that farming can be a curse. Actually, you know what? We had a hand. What are some of the ways that farming could be a curse, right? What are some of the negative aspects of farming? Yeah.
Insects, weather.
Yeah, I mean, right. So even though there might be a perceived sense that you are in control of your food system, drought, floods, insects, weather, they can decimate an entire crop, right? Which again is why you want to be able to have a surplus in good years. But yeah, you're actually a little bit more vulnerable than you might think. Yeah. Slavery, absolutely, right? So farming historically has been one of the most oppressive industries in human history. Going back to ancient Egypt, the use of slaves, and really continuing even until this present day. I mean, we know that slavery has been abolished in this country, but farm workers in this country are still being oppressed in very intense ways that some liken to modern day slavery. And that has just been the case with agriculture throughout all of history. Any other ideas? Well, one of the warnings I take it as, one of the experiences that we see in our own tradition is the story of Joseph. So Joseph, as you may know, had many brothers and they did not get along, and they ultimately kind of staged his death and sold him into slavery. And through a very unusual set of circumstances, he ends up being Pharaoh's right-hand man. Partly because of his dream interpretation skills. So Pharaoh has these dreams and Joseph interprets them to mean that there's going to be 7 years of plenty, 7 years of surplus, followed by 7 years of famine. And that during the years of surplus, the Pharaoh should basically consolidate all of that surplus, should hoard the wealth. And that's what happens. And so then the famine strikes, just as predicted. And it says, now there was no food in the entire land, for the famine had grown exceedingly severe. And the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan were exhausted because of the famine. And Joseph collected all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan with the grain that they were buying. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. So you have all these people in the whole region, including his family, who make their voyage down to Egypt, and that's how the Israelites end up in Egypt in the first place, come to the Pharaoh and say, here, take our money. We're hungry. Can we buy some of your surplus? That's in year one. Now the money gets depleted, right, in all the land of Egypt. So the people come and they say, give us food. Why should we die in your presence if the money has been used up? You have more food. Please give us some. And Joseph said, okay, well, give me your livestock, and I'll give you food if the money has been used up. So they brought their livestock and they give that to Joseph in exchange for food. And he provides them for food in that year. So that's the end of the first year. Then they come to him in the second year and they said, why should we die? Why should we starve to death? We don't have any more money. We don't have any more livestock. Buy us and our land, and just give us food. And so Joseph bought all the farmland of the Egyptians for Pharaoh, for the Egyptians sold each one his field, for the famine had become too strong for them, and the land became Pharaoh's. So in 2 years, Pharaoh consolidates the wealth and the power and the land of the entire region in 2 years. So I take that as a real warning, right? I know that Joseph is one of our ancestors who we hold up and we praise, and he was very smart and cunning. I think in this example, it shows the dangers of agricultural societies when that surplus can get consolidated and controlled by just a few. So our ancestors come down, are part of that experience, settle in the land of Egypt. Ultimately, everyone dies. There's a new Pharaoh. There's new Israelites. They don't get along. We know the story. The Israelites are enslaved and experience 200 years of slavery, and then are freed. Now, they're wandering in the desert for 40 years, and what is it that they're eating? They're eating the manna, right? That every day the tradition teaches us that they go out and there was enough food to eat. But what were the rules about the manna? You could only take what you needed in that moment. You could not take any more. If you did, it would spoil, with the one exception being Shabbat. And on Shabbat, you could take 2 portions that you wouldn't have to gather on Shabbat. I think of that as a little bit of a cleansing of the palate, right? Having lived in Egypt for close to 400 years, being fully part of an agricultural society that was highly oppressive, that for 40 years they revert back to gathering, to just eating off of the abundance and not hoarding any wealth. And they're moving, they're migratory. They move back to that sense of moving along, right? And then when they're about to enter the land of Israel, they're given a series of instructions. And it starts with this passage. It says, for the land that you are about to enter and possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come. There, the grain you sowed had to be watered by your own labors like a vegetable garden. But the land you are about to cross into and possess, a land of hills and valleys, soaks up its waters from the rains of heaven. So in this moment they're about to come in to becoming sovereign and also farmers in this new land, we are reminded that it's a different story than what they experienced in Egypt. In Egypt, there was the Nile River, and the Nile would flood every year, which allowed them to build these vast irrigation channels, which essentially allowed them to grow food in an unlimited kind of way, right? So just like endless growth and oppression and oppression. But in the land that the Israelites are entering, it's a different story. We're dependent on rain, right? So that already, we're going to be farmers, but we're already relinquishing a certain amount of control, which I think is an important teaching from our tradition, right? That we recognize that we're going to farm, but it's a partnership, and we're not fully in charge. Whereas I imagine the mentality of the Egyptian rulers and farmers was one of, we're in control, we're exploiting the land for our own use. And we're even told that the rain is a reflection of our moral well-being. It's an indicator. Do we want to know how we're doing as a society? Well, is it raining in the right time, right? If then you obey the commandments that I enjoin upon you this day, this is from the second paragraph of the Shema, you might recognize it. Loving the Lord your God and serving him with all your heart and soul, I will grant the rain for your land in season, the early rain and the late. You shall gather in your new grain and wine and oil. I will also provide grass in the fields for your cattle, and thus shall you eat your fill. One note, I usually do not use the him pronoun for God. My favorite quote is, the pronoun for God is God, but this is a translation that made it in there. I will also provide grass in the fields for your cattle, and thus you shall eat your fill, right? If we follow the blueprint that we're given, then it will work. And if it doesn't, then we won't. So what is this blueprint? What is the Jewish agricultural blueprint, right? So again, for the first time in our history, we're going to become farmers, because when Joseph's family came down to Egypt, they were shepherds, not farmers. And they went through this transition. Well, we're going to go through a few examples of some of these guidelines. Now, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest, nor shall you glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the needy and for the stranger. So this includes a few different practices. The practice of peah, of not letting the corners of, not harvesting from the corners of your field. So if you imagine your farm, each corner, some amount of the corner is left for people who need to come and harvest their own food. Also the gleanings, the things that fall as you're harvesting. The fallen fruit of the vineyard. There's also the forgotten sheaf. So if you went out and harvested and you left a bundle of wheat in the field and you forgot it, you have to leave that alone, right? There's all these layers of how the food gets shared. And I think an interesting point about peah, about leaving the corner of your field, is that it's not I guess with all of these, but in particular that, you're not even harvesting it. You know, there's other laws where you donate some of what you harvest. But why do you think we might leave the corners of the field for people to come and harvest for themselves? Yeah.
They don't have to ask.
So they don't have to ask. Great. How so? How so?
Well, I don't know. I guess if they're poor or something by nature, then they just not to be embarrassed.
Yeah. Right. There's guidelines. It's right. It helps preserve some dignity. Yeah.
Well, the corners are easier to get to, and you don't have to walk across the entire field so that everybody sees what you're doing.
Right.
And it preserves their individual, their independence.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. What else?
It ensures that the food will still be fresh when it's picked.
Right. They're getting it as good as anyone else, right? They're not even getting the seconds or but they're getting the prime real estate just like everyone else. Yeah. What else?
They actually have to work and they actually have to harvest it themselves. So it gives them a better appreciation, I would imagine, of getting the food. It's not just being given to them. They actually have to work to get it.
Yeah, right. There's a kind of idea of sweat equity there, right? That they get to, they have the opportunity to put in the effort and feel the reward of the food. Yeah.
I learned in another course that Jews traditionally swept around their kitchen, not in the corners first. They would just do around the kitchen and then scoop it up. Now that seemed to have been a Jewish thing.
I've never heard that before, but that's amazing.
Can you say that again?
I'm very good at not sweeping in the corners.
Right, where when the Jews came up from Spain, and they came all the way up to New Mexico, there were a lot of people there who did not know they were Jewish, but they would sweep their floors that way.
Huh.
From generation to generation, they learned to do that.
To not sweep in the
Not
corners.
sweep in the corners, just go around like a circle. You know, I don't know how many of your parents did that, and then they would go around and then sweep it up.
Huh.
So I wonder if it had anything.
Yeah, well, it's also that this is the practice where you get the growing payas, the side locks, right? You leave the corners of the rabbis equate your face to a field, and so you leave the corners of your field, and that's why often religious men have beards and side locks that are called payot. Yeah, these are all great answers, right? There's a lot of reasons why. One other one that I think is important is that it allows people to keep certain literacy and skills alive, right? In this year, they might be vulnerable. They might not have a field. They might not have their own farm to work, but that doesn't mean in a year or two that might be different. And so this is a chance to make sure that they're keeping those skills fresh. Here's another one about leaving the gleanings, and then it says, "You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, therefore I am commanding you to do this thing." And this is a refrain that gets repeated over and over and over again, right? The most repeated phrase in the entire Torah is to not oppress the stranger, and it often goes hand in hand with the idea that because we were strangers or we were slaves in the land of Egypt, that our experience is one that forms our identity and our sense of collective morality, and that one of the kind of the most basic ways that shows up is in the agricultural laws, how we feed ourselves, which is, humans have always been organizing ourselves around how we feed ourselves. And so from that very foundation, we're going to do so in a just and equitable way. Yeah?
Yes, well, this sort of reminds me of Ruth in the Bible, who was a cleaner.
Yeah.
And in Boaz's fields, I believe.
Yeah.
She ultimately married him, where she's the progenitor of King David.
Yep.
The progenitor of the Shia when it comes to.
Exactly. And right, and they would have only interacted because that it was not just a handout, but Ruth was coming to glean on the fields.
She was a stranger.
Right? And she had been a stranger. And that is held up on the holiday that we celebrate receiving the Torah. That is one of the stories that we read, that bringing the gleaner, welcoming the stranger, ensuring that their needs are being met is what led to King David and leads to a messianic age. Hold on one second. So we see this refrain repeated over and over and over again in the context of these laws and other laws. Okay, here's two other laws. Don't plow, related to animal welfare. Don't plow an ox and a donkey harnessed together, and don't muzzle an ox while it is threshing. Any ideas why you wouldn't be permitted to do those things? Yeah.
One's stronger than the other, so one will be doing the majority of the burden, and the other ones so they can eat.
Yeah. Right, that there's a recognition there of the innate value of the animals and that they're not just there to serve our needs, right? This is what it looks like when you yoke an ox and a donkey together, the ox clearly being significantly stronger, right? And I get it, right? If you only have one ox and one donkey, that's maybe better than just one or the other, but we're in all of these laws, what we are reminded of and what we're encouraged to cultivate is a sense of humility, a sense of deference, a sense of this is not only about us, right? It's not only about me as an individual. I have to think about the other members of my community and make sure that they're being taken care of. And it's also not only about humans, it's also about the other animals and plants. Another component that I think is interesting, I'm curious, I don't know, I'm curious how unique this is in various different traditions. Here we're told, do not neglect the Levite in your community, for he has no hereditary portion as you have. Every third year you shall bring out the full tithe of your field that year, but leave it within your settlements. Then the Levite who has no hereditary portion as you have, and the stranger and the orphan and the widow in your settlements shall come and eat their fill, so that Hashem your God may bless all the work of your hands that you do. And so here we have the priests. The Levites are the priestly class were the one tribe that was not given land, right? And you can imagine in most early civilizations, the priests probably had a lot of power and a lot of wealth and a lot of control, right? And what we're taught in our tradition is that it's a good idea to have some separation of powers, right? It's a good idea to put some limits. If you're a priest, Your job is to be a spiritual leader in the community. It's not to amass a lot of personal wealth, and you're not allowed to own land. And you have to also live off of the generosity of the other people in the community, which I think is a very, I'm curious how unique that is, but it's certainly, to me, it jumps out a lot. And then the kind of some of my favorite components of this tradition are these cycles of sacred rest. So here we have, you shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. Again, this is repeated. 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its field, but in the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow. Let the needy among your people eat of it, and what they leave, let the wild beasts eat of it. So every 7 years, we're instructed to let the land rest completely. And there's a little bit of a puzzling component there, so that let the needy among your people eat of it. You know, there's a question, what exactly are they eating if you're not growing anything on those fields in that year? And we'll get to that in a minute. And what they leave, let the wild beasts eat of it. So you're even thinking about what the animals, both the domesticated and the wild animals. One way of reading the Shemitah year, this is the sabbatical year is called the Shemitah year in Hebrew. And Shemitah in Hebrew means release, right? So it's kind of a vague concept, and I love that because the way I read it is it's a release of control. It's a release of ownership. It's a release of saying, for in this year I'm going to release any aspirations I have of being in control of the planet, and I'm going to see what comes on its own. And I will eat that, and I will share that freely with other plants, other animals, and other humans and other animals. And then that is followed up. 6 days shall you do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest, in order that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and that your bondsman and the stranger may be refreshed. So this is the commandment to keep Shabbat. Every 7 days we keep Shabbat. And the reason given is that, in different places in the Torah, there's different reasons given for keeping Shabbat. In this case, it's so that basically all the people that work for you can rest. And we might take this concept a little bit for granted, but we have to remember how radical of an idea this was at the time, that you're creating a society where every single person gets a day off. Every animal gets a day off. You're not even allowed to have your animals work for you on Shabbat, right? That is something that did not exist in that time. The only people who got to take any days off were wealthy, were elite people. And this is a great equalizer, that every single person of any class level, Jewish, not Jewish, human, animal, all get to take a day off. And that is such a radical idea. And if you can imagine maybe people in this day and age who are really struggling to make ends meet, they probably don't feel like they can afford it. Right? So, but we're commanded to, meaning we have to create the systems that allow that to take place. There's another component of the Shemitah year, of the sabbatical year, that's important here. And this is actually where the word Shemitah really shows up. At the end of every 7 years, you will make a release, a Shemitah. This is the nature of the release. Every creditor will release what he loaned his neighbor and his brother, as it is declared a release to God. So at the end of the Shemitah year, if someone owed you money, that debt is erased, or at least your ability to ask for the repayment is erased. I recently learned the debt is actually not forgiven, and if the person wants to return it, they're encouraged to, but you as a debt holder can never bring it up again. An idea that, and again, these are loans that are interest-free to begin with, right? This is not any sort of like financial lending operation or business. These are free loans that are made to help people who are struggling. And basically, if by the end of the Shemitah year they can't pay it back, you let it go, because our tradition is teaching us it's not really our money, right? Our goal here is to figure out a way to make sure everyone's needs are being met. And if I need to share a little bit of my surplus with you to make sure that as a community where our most basic needs are being met, that's the priority. If you think about the story with Joseph and how over the course of 2 years they were able to consolidate all the money, the land, and the people. think about some of the implications of the Shemitah year, of the sabbatical year. All debt is forgiven. All land is ownerless, right? I don't know if I mentioned that, but it's not just that we don't farm, we actually are releasing claims of ownership over our land. So the land is technically public property, and during a Shemitah year, anyone can walk on anyone's land. You're not even allowed to have fences up that keep people or animals out. So for that year, land becomes ownerless. And it's while everyone observes the Shemitah on the same year, there's another cycle of 7 that is different for every person, and that is the terms of indentured servitude, or Hebrew slavery in our tradition. That it's 6 years, and in the 7th year you're let free. So that happens no matter when you start in the Shemitah cycle, but it is mentioned right after this. It's clearly connected to the same cycle. So if you can imagine these fixes being in place in a place like Egypt, it prevents that kind of consolidation of wealth and land and power. It allows for a reset to happen. And in fact, there's one more kind of concentric circle. You have Shabbat and then Shemitah every 7 years. After 7 cycles of 7 years, you have the Yovel, the Jubilee year, where not just is all land ownerless and all debt forgiven and you don't farm, but all land actually goes back to the original family of the original tribe that first lived on that land. It's a giant reset button, because the goal here is to keep going. It's not just so that a few people can become exceedingly wealthy while others suffer. The idea is that as a community, we want to be able to keep going all the way into the future. And there's a recognition that inevitably there's going to be wealthy people and poor people. There's going to be disparities of wealth. What we're striving for is a balance that makes sure that everyone's needs are being met, while also giving some space for there to be this kind of disparity. So I'm not sure if you can read that, but from this whole kind of read of these texts and this story, we've come up with what we think of as 7 core Jewish agricultural values. So Jewish agricultural traditions compel us to create a food system that centers the needs of the most vulnerable, encourages gratitude and generosity, values physical labor, treats workers and animals fairly, and integrates cycles of sacred rest for all. It facilitates emotional and spiritual connection to food, plants, nature, and wilderness, celebrates through feasting and fasting, as we've probably just all experienced over the last few weeks, redistributes land and wealth, and puts limits on power. And that is the core values that animate the Jewish agricultural tradition. So then the question becomes, okay, what do we do with that? What does that mean for us right now? So I want to offer a couple of kind of vague ideas and hope that they give you some sense of how you can bring some of these values to life in your own daily lives. So on a personal level, I think one of the most basic things we can do, and our tradition certainly encourages us to do it, is give thanks before and after we eat. Just that pause, just that moment of thinking about the food that we're about to eat, where it came from. Think about all the people who played a part in bringing it to you, from the farmers to the truck drivers to the supermarket shelf stockers. Everyone who played a part. How can we kind of take a moment to honor their effort, right? And certainly after, I remember this teaching that I learned as a kid, that it's so much easier to ask nicely when you want something, not when you've already had it, right? So most traditions have a blessing or a way of expressing gratitude before you eat, and our tradition says we also need to offer something after we eat. So whatever that looks like for you, again, it could just be a simple pause, or it could be the full traditional blessing. On an economic level, you can think about who it is that you want to support. What kind of food products do you want to support? Is it a higher priority for you to support a local farmer at a farmer's market that might be a little bit more expensive than the supermarket, but you feel like it's reflecting your values? Maybe try to make that a priority. Just give that some thought when you're making your food choices. the law that we mentioned about the priest, the tithing, ma'aser in Hebrew, that's where we get this idea of giving 10%, right? We've kind of, because most of us are not farmers anymore, we're not donating 10% of our crops, but some people have the practice of donating 10% of their incomes. Well, another way of thinking about that is, what might it look like to donate 10% of your time to a more just and equitable food system? So maybe that's volunteering at a soup kitchen once a week. Maybe it's finding an organization that you can support with your volunteer hours, instead of just making it about money, but actually your time, and invest and build relationships in our local community with the people who are growing food in this region and working to make a more just and equitable food system. And on the biggest picture, on the political level, there's a massive piece of legislation that most of us don't pay any attention to, and it's called the Farm Bill, and it gets renewed every 4 to 6 years or so, and it includes everything from agricultural subsidies to trade rules to school lunch programs to SNAP benefits. It affects people in ways that they have no idea. Get engaged with that, talk to your local representatives about it, and make sure that the programs that are protecting the most vulnerable people in our community are being funded. And I think for me, that's a real reflection of some of these values. So I want to open it up to questions and comments. Yeah.
Everything you've discussed to me comes from the original document of Torah. We believe is God's word through Moshe Rabbeinu, they Israel, and to our own age, and it's just as relevant now, more relevant than when it was originally written. And many Jews feel it's old-fashioned. It has no meaning nowadays. You just showed how relevant it really is.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that's our task. We're told every generation has to wrestle with the Torah anew, right? We just, in our shul on Simchat Torah, we have this practice where we open up the entire Torah, we unroll the entire Torah, it makes a giant circle, and we see that process of going from the beginning and wrapping around to the end, and then with one breath continuing back into the beginning. And we know that it's a reminder that we're all supposed to wrestle with this, with these stories, with these values, with these instructions, and figure out how to make those alive for us today. I mean, that's what Jews have been doing forever, right? And we're part of that, and it's an important tradition to continue. Yeah.
You're connected with, or you work on a farm?
So we have, so we're based in West Philadelphia. We have a small garden that we manage, and we run some of our programming out of that. And we work in partnership. There's a very vibrant urban farming movement in Philadelphia. Gardens and farms ranging from the size of this room to 3 or 4 acres big. So we work in partnership with a lot of those farms. We try to support their work by recruiting volunteers and mobilizing them to go help out on those farms.
It's an actual farm in West Philly?
So we have a garden in West Philly that's like, a little smaller than this room. And then we partner with a number of farms, some of which are in West Philly, but other ones are in other parts of the city. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Any thoughts on how to pass these values on to our children and grandchildren?
Yeah. So, I think some of these suggestions, you can start pretty young, right? Just the idea of creating a practice with young kids of giving thanks and appreciating their food and all the people who played a part in it. In Philadelphia, I don't know if there's too many farmers markets out here, but in Philadelphia, there's a handful of farmers markets. And I like to bring my kids to the farmers market, and they get a chance to meet some of the people working on the local farms. We go to a number of the urban farms on a regular basis. It's becoming more and more of a thing. I mean, you might have noticed that right here on the Gratz College campus, Ramat Day Camp has a very large garden, and that's become a pretty big component of the camp program, as I understand it. And I think that's a great way, is getting kids connected to growing food from a young age. I mean, kids love eating food right off the plant. And they'll, and so if you can facilitate that process, I think that's a great way to start. Yeah.
I think the Indians have the same concept of land ownership, that there is no private land.
Right. Right. And in fact, it says very explicitly in the Torah, it says, basically God reminds us that the land is not ours, right? That we're not, and I've been told that in Israel, maybe you know that that when you buy a property, it's actually like a 49-year lease or something like that, which honors the tradition of the Yovel, the Jubilee. Yeah. But does that actually, like, if you owned a house for 49 years, is someone actually going to come and take it back, or how does that?
It's a land, it's not the house.
Oh, it's the,
It's a land.
Right. So that's another thing, is that there are a lot of different ways that people have structured their relationship to land in terms of ownership. And there are some, there are land trusts, for example, that are community trusts that own the land, and then you can build your house on it, but and you own the house, but not the land beneath it. And the idea is that people shouldn't own land, and that is reflected in a number of different cultures. Yeah. Yeah.
I think there's a whole health component to this also, when you're eating foods that aren't processed or full of chemicals and full of dyes. And I think that it's good to teach children at a young age just trying to stay away from processed food by taking them out to farms and farmers markets, and showing them that they're fresh food rather than all this processed stuff. It's so much better for their health long term.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's really true and important. And, it's important to remember that a lot of what we call food today, didn't exist 100 years ago. We have a magnet on our fridge that says, eat organic food, or as your grandmother called it, food, right? Like that's what all food was not that long ago. And, the history of chemical agriculture is not a pleasant one. It's companies that first were creating chemical weapons that were used to kill people. And then they said, well, if we tweak it a little bit, it'll kill all the bugs that we don't want eating our crops. And we're actually experiencing now some major ecological challenges that are a result of chemical agriculture, both in terms of pesticides and herbicides, and also fertilizers. And, there's a reason why the organic farming movement and the sustainable farming movement is growing so rapidly. It's because it's needed. And when people get involved in that and they're connected to local small scale organic farmers, the quality of the food is just so much better. Most of the food that we eat that is part of our national food system is not grown for flavor or nutrition. It's grown to be able to withstand 2 weeks from the time it's harvested until you eat it. But when you're buying food that was harvested the day before from a local farmer, it's night and day. Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing is to bring your grandchildren to pick your own
Absolutely.
events at your closest farm or whatever, because I remember the first time I saw Brussels sprouts growing on this rock. It is amazing.
Yeah.
And they're not easy to cut off.
Right.
So that and broccoli, and I think that it's important that the kids go and they pick their own apples, they pick their own strawberries, and they pick their own Brussels sprouts.
Yeah. And I have 2 kids that are almost 3 and almost 5, and they love Brussels sprouts. I mean, we still struggle with it. They just want to eat pasta all the time, but they love Brussels sprouts. There's certain things that we just didn't tell them that other kids don't, or that kids aren't supposed to like those things. But yeah, I think just kind of connecting kids from an early age to even having a small garden. I mean, my kids, we don't bring any tomatoes in from the garden because the kids are just eating them all day out there. So, and that's great. And they now can see that kind of relationship between the natural world around them, that there's abundance there, that they can partake in that. Yeah.
We live across the street from kind of a park, and it's owned by the Philadelphia Water Department, and they have a facility there with water, whatever. And a few years ago, a couple, a male and a female, came there, and I don't know if they rented space or part of the park, whatever, but they were organic farmers.
Mm-hmm.
And they stayed there and they farmed their whole, like Wednesday afternoon, like before 6, they would sell off some of their goods.
Yeah.
It was absolutely delicious, so fresh. You just go and you almost picked it yourself there and ate it. And unfortunately, they didn't stay on that long, maybe 2 years. Then they went west somewhere.
Right.
Maybe with your group, I don't know. It was wonderful.
Yeah, there's some interesting work happening by the city right now. I'm less familiar with out here in the suburbs, but the city government in Philly is really trying to support urban agriculture in a variety of ways. And the water department in particular has been a really progressive city agency. They're really concerned with stormwater runoff. And when we pave over everything, that adds to their problems. So they've incentivized projects that catch more water, and farms and gardens are a great way to do that. So they've been taking some of the land that they own and have been transforming it, and they've been letting other people use some of their land. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was part of a city program.
They'll give you a rain barrel.
They'll give you a rain barrel. There's other kind of garden infrastructure that they'll support. Yeah, it's really great. Great. Well, I just want to close. I want to echo the bracha that we read, the blessing that we read earlier. That where if we can embody these values, that all of the work of our hands will be blessed. That kol ma'aseh yadenu will be blessed. And I hope that going into this new year, coming out of the holiday season, that we can bring the energy from that and help to make a more just and equitable and sustainable world. So thank you.
Thank you. Everybody, before you go, if you could just fill out those evaluation forms for us. It's green over there, but it is green. Good. Thank you.
Excuse me, yeah.